Good evening and welcome to St. Peter's Church. My name is Bálint Karosi. I am the music director classical at St. Peter's Church. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's concert, honoring the life and the work of Hungarian composer Gyorgy Ligeti. Co-organized by the Arts and Architecture Conservancy at St. Peter's and the Liszt Institute Cultural Center in New York City. It is my honor to welcome you at St. Peter's after a devastating flood that made the sanctuary, this beautiful architectural marvel, inaccessible for 2 years. The organ that you will hear briefly tonight in Ligeti's Hungarian Rock, which is a transcription from harpsichord, in fact, but it works perfectly on the organ. The organ was tonally fully redesigned and rebuilt by C.B. Fisk in Gloucester, Massachusetts. It was fully taken out of the sanctuary, shipped to Massachusetts, and brought back after the sanctuary was fully restored. And if you don't have a brochure, you should have it at the entrance about our organ inaugural events on November 4th and November 5th that will also feature an organ concerto in memory of Gyorgy Ligeti. So this concert is in partnership with the Liszt Institute on 53rd Street, just a few blocks from here. Please give a round of applause and warm welcome to Dr. Csenge Palotai, the director of the Institute, whose sponsorship made this concert possible.
Thank you, Bálint, for your kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I am truly honored to stand before you this evening to celebrate the exceptional life and artistic contributions of one of Hungary's most visionary composers, Gyorgy Ligeti. As the sun sets and the stars begin to twinkle above us, we gather here to pay a tribute of a musical genius whose work transcended borders and continues to inspire a generation of musicians and music lovers worldwide. For Hungary, Ligeti stands as a symbol of cultural pride and artistic excellence. His compositions, characterized by their innovation and boundary-pushing nature, represent the very essence of Hungarian creativity. In his work, one can hear echoes of Hungarian folk music, a deep connection to his roots, and a profound understanding of the rich musical traditions of his homeland. I am especially honored to welcome Mr. Martin Bresnick, professor of composition at the Yale School of Music, who was the last student of Gyorgy Ligeti, and as such as he has an unparalleled insight and understanding of Ligeti, not only as a composer, but also personally. Tonight, as we embark on a musical journey of Ligeti's composition, let us remember that music, like Ligeti himself, knows no boundaries. It is a universal language that transcend geographical and cultural differences, connecting us all through the power of sound and emotion. György Ligeti is one that we Hungarians, and indeed the whole world, can be exceptionally proud of. He reminds us that even in the face of adversity, creativity and innovation can flourish, leaving a permanent mark on the world. As we immerse ourselves in his music this evening, let us celebrate that enduring spirit of György Ligeti and the lasting impact of his compositions on the world of music. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, please enjoy the enchanting evening of Ligeti's unique music. Thank you, Bálint, for making this wonderful evening possible.
And now, without too much further ado, I would like to introduce to Professor Bresnick, who was my advisor at Yale School of Music when I did my doctorate in composition. And the first time we met, we had a few words exchanged in Hungarian, and ever since we have a special connection, I think, through Ligeti. So welcome, Martin Bresnick.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm grateful to the Liszt Society and to Bálint Karosi. He tells me he uses the American Karosi rather than Karosi, the Hungarian. And you'll forgive me, all the Hungarian speakers, for my Americanization of all the Hungarian names in their order. I was a student of György Ligeti's as early as 1972. And I will tell you a little bit more about that experience, the experience of a lifelong friendship and association. Can people hear me? I hope, yeah. And I want to share this with you with some of the whimsy and wit and friendly humanity that characterized Ligeti himself in his association with other musicians and other students, and I was particularly privileged to have that experience myself. But rather than having this whole conversation before the musicians play and make them wait a long time to come out and represent this wonderful music, with your indulgence, ladies and gentlemen, I will withdraw after introducing the musicians and come back at the end and tell you what I want to tell you about Ligeti, but also leave the floor open to you to interact with me and ask questions that might occur to you. It'll give us a chance to do that with a great deal of friendly informality after we hear the music of one of the great masters of 20th century music. So to begin with this evening, you will be hearing a total of actually 8 very early songs by Ligeti, songs that he composed before he left Hungary in his escape from Hungary in 1956. These songs will be performed by 2 young, very wonderful and promising Hungarian musicians, the collaborative pianist Viktória Sarkadi, who has studied in Hungary and then in Scotland, and most recently has taken up her studies to concluding studies here at the Bard College in New York City, in New York State, up New York State. The singer, the soprano, is Mária Lökösházi, and she is a Hungarian soprano who remains in Hungary, is visiting for a very brief time. We're very fortunate to have her. She has won prizes and is about at the very beginning of an extremely promising career in Europe. Then, of course, Bálint asked me not to introduce him again, but I want to introduce this wonderful musician who is not only was a terrific composer with whom I had the pleasure of working when he was at Yale, but also a magnificent clarinet player, which you will not hear tonight, and finally, an organist, of which he is a complete master, and you will hear this in Ligeti's whimsical and amusing Hungarian rock. Finally, the evening will conclude with a series of ricercari of Ligeti's, 8 of them performed by Lisa Moore, studied at Sydney Conservatorium in her native Australia, eventually at Eastman, and finally a doctorate at Stony Brook after European Studies, also with the renowned Yvonne Loriot, who some of you might know as the great interpreter of Messiaen's compositions. And she will then play 3 of Ligeti's very demanding but incredibly moving etudes for piano. But we'll begin first with the songs. So let's welcome our young performers.
Kis bokor ne hajts még, tél ez nem tavasz. Kislány, ne sóhajts még, nem tudod mi az. Szép virág a rózsa, hát még a bimbója, mert az éghharmatja minden nap mosdatja. Szép virág a szűzlány ünnepnapra kelve, legszebb virág a haza szent szerelme. Nem terem az kertben a fekete földből, sem a virágágyból soha ki nem zöldül. Csak terem az éppen az ember szívében, az ember szívének legis legmélyebben. kicsit ne székeljük, ha jól esik, hiszen egy-két italbortul ez a világ fel nem fordul. Ha felfordul, mit én bánom, abba sincsen semmi károm. Tánkit a sors fejre buktat, akkor ismét talpra juthat. S ha felfordul, mit én bánom, s abba sincsen semmi károm. Tán bizony még használ neki, tán bizony még használ neki. Úgy esik alul a gazda. Párja vesztett Kilicinek szíve fáj. Fülemire panaszát oly zengatál. Ne szomorkodj, fülemileg gerlice. A te bajod az enyémhez semmi sem. Égi madár hegyen, völgyön megszállhat, társa helyen társra megint találhat. Jaj, de nekem nincs se hazám, se párom. A világot egyes egyedül járom. Messzi honom tája körül, jaj, bekik, azt se tudom, hegye az ott vagy az ég. Azt se tudom, eljutok-e oda még. Vagy sose lesz egyéb hazám, mint az ég. Az ördög elvitte a fináncot. Jött az ördög hegedű szóval, elvitte a fináncot. Elvitte a fináncot, és minden asszony így kihalt, Belzebub. Éljen a táncot! Az ördög, az ördög, az ördög oda van a fináncol. Cefrét verünk, főzünk italt, lakomát csapunk, nagy táncot. Lakomát csapunk, nagy táncot, szépen köszönjük, hogy viszed Belzebút. A fináncot! Az ördög, az ördög, az ördöge táncol, oda van, oda van, oda van, oda van a finánccal. Táncol a holt fényben, kékes fényben fürdék minden. Jár az óra, tik-tak, tik-tak, ne szólj ablak, hogyha nyitlak, ne szólj lány, ha még csókollak. Fehér inge van a holdnak. Gyümölcsfürt ingatja a szél, ágon lívek, duzzadtan a fénytől. Kalmár jött nagy madarakkal. A herceg kisasszony meg ne lássa, őrizzétek a herceg kisasszonyt. Kalmár jött nagy madarakkal. A gyerekek kiabálnak. A herceg kisasszony meg ne halljon, ne halljon. A herceg kisasszony sápat sose szól. Szívébe sok nagy madár rikácsol. Őrizzétek a herceg kisasszonyt.
follow that. I really don't know. So may I ask at this moment all the performers to rise for another round of applause, the singers and Bálint. They are wonderful. So how do you sum up the work of this magisterial, quirky, humorous, profound, and very startling composer in a few words or in a few minutes? There's no way to do it. And I'm not a musicologist and I'm not a scholar. I'm a composer who studied with Ligeti. And so I thought the way I would go about this would be to give you a kind of sequence of the dates, the significant dates in my interactions with Ligeti, and relate some of the things he said at the time and the interesting interactions that we had, which had such a profound effect on my life and on my own music as well. I'll begin, and I'll try to go this, I'm a very chronological sort of fellow, and I'll do this chronologically and hopefully get through as much of it as I can quickly, and then allow you to poke me and see what interesting things you want to know more about. It's difficult also because I'm not entirely sure how much background some of you have about Ligeti, through which certain things I would say would be repetitive or too obvious. On the other hand, there is also the enormous context of his Hungarianness, so conceived, that that needs to be elicited and problematized, because it is an important part of who he was, in my view. The beginning is, the pre-Ligeti beginning goes back for me to 1968, when I was a graduate student at Stanford University, and I was working very closely with another significant mentor in my life, John Chowning, who is in some ways the father of computer music in our world. You may not know him, but he's the guy who invented the algorithm with the computer that's in all the synthesizers that you play now. It's the DX7 algorithms, and frequency modulation is the technique. In any case, I was just a young student. I was 21, and Chowning was so inspiring, and one day he left a score for me to look at. He said, "You might find this interesting." And I remember that sunny afternoon in Palo Alto, and he left it on the table, and I opened the score, and to me at first it looked like a whole bunch of ants had crawled across this orchestral page and slowly got denser and denser as they all kind of creamed up to the bar line. And I looked at that and I suddenly thought, my God, this composer, and I never heard of him, is doing things with the orchestra that we are conceiving with the computer, but is taking a long time to do in the early days of digital analog conversion. But I said, this music is amazing. I've never seen anything quite like this. It turned out to be the score of Ligeti's Atmospheres. In 1968, it was hard even to find a recording. It turns out there was a very early recording with Leonard Bernstein, but it was almost unlocatable. And this is before the great Kubrick adventures of 2001, where that music is used in the movie. People know that? Raise your hand if you know that. That Atmospheres forms a very important part of Kubrick's soundtrack for 2001. But that didn't exist when I first saw it, and so I began to search wherever I could find Ligeti music. It was very hard to find. Then 2001 happened in early 1969, and suddenly there were recordings of Lux Aeterna, his segment that was abstracted from his great Requiem. The Requiem itself, particularly the Kyrie, which is used very frequently whenever you see the monolith in the movie. That's Ligeti's Kyrie. It's a canonic micropolyphonic structure. And I started listening to this, and I got very, very excited about it. And I decided that I had to study with Ligeti, that I would just have to happen somehow. At that time, Ligeti was really not teaching in any regular way. He had some stints as a teacher, interestingly enough, in Sweden. Some of you might know that. He did teach in the early 60s. One of his students, interestingly enough, at that time, well, two interesting ones, actually. One was Terry Riley, who had gone to Sweden, and the other one was Arvo Pärt, who had gone to Sweden. History records this now in a very different way. If you know Terry Riley's music or Arvo Pärt's music, you will not be maybe that surprised to discover that they sat in on a class with Ligeti in Sweden. But Ligeti was not employed by any particular university, so getting the Fulbright committee to allow me to study with him or to do that took some doing. And I wrote to him, he accepted me as a student. And I got the Fulbright, which spared me lots of trouble with the draft, actually, as it turns out. This was 1969, by the way. And I went off to Vienna to study with Ligeti. So in 1969, I arrive in Vienna, and I call him up, and when I call him up, he says, well, Martin, I'm always tempted to imitate his charming Hungarian accented English. I don't know, Bálint, it's embarrassing a little bit. I did it. I actually did the accent for him, which also he thought was very funny too. But okay, but I won't do it just now. But I called him up, and I'll come to the right moment. I'll do it. He said, "Well, I'm terribly sorry, Martin. I have just won the Berlin Künstlerpreis, and I have to go to Berlin for the year." So there was my year with Ligeti out the window. I had arrived in Vienna to study with him, and he was gone. I ended up actually spending the year with a wonderful Austrian composer, very remarkable character named Gottfried von Einem, not very well known generally in America, but very stimulating, very interesting person, but it wasn't Ligeti. However, the story then begins. I finally get to meet him. I had not yet actually met him. When he came to Vienna in 69, and he brought some scores with him. And Vienna Musical Society, it's a pretty strange place, and Ligeti's dwelling was Vienna. He had come from Hungary to Vienna. I'm skipping over all the Hungarian stuff, obviously, but that brought him there. But he was still kind of finding his feet in relationship to the European avant-garde, and he came to Vienna, and all the students crowded around in this little radio reception room where he was going to play segments of some new works of his, including, by the way, ramifications and some other ramifications that work for retuned string orchestras. And he was incredibly charming. His German was, again, Hungarian accented German, but very, very good German. There was Lothar Knezel, who was the most important Austrian muckety-muck from the ORF radio, and he sat right in the front row, and Ligeti took out the scores, and he looked in the back, and he said, "Oh, you in the front, you don't need this," and he handed it over the heads of all the press and radio people to the students in the back of the row, which was a gesture given the hierarchy of Austrian musical society, it upset the Austrians, but it made the students very, very happy. And it gives you a feeling for the kind of person that Ligeti was. He was a kind of provocateur, and I don't want to domesticate him for you. I don't want to tell stories that make him seem like he's just an ordinary guy with a nice. He was not. He was a very unusual and unique kind of person. And at this moment, it's good to unpack that a little bit. If you know a little bit about Hungarian history, you'll know that in the early 20th century, and even in the late 19th century, Hungarian-born people who were not actually Christian, who had German names, changed their names in order to fit in better with Hungarian society. Some of them succeeded in doing this, but not completely. Ligeti and his family is one of them. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. Ligeti's family name is not actually his family name as it was originally. The original family name was Auer, A-U-E-R. His great uncle was Leopold Auer, the great violinist who taught so many Russian violin students. But because of the need to accommodate the conditions in Budapest and in Hungary in those days, the family took a name, Ligeti, which my Hungarian friends can tell me if it somehow means hour. Hour in German is a location or a place. I don't know. But he joins, when the family, Ligeti family, joins other families at the same time, of, for example, a guy named Georg Lichtenfeld, who you probably know better as Lukács, Georg Lukács, the great critic and intellectual of Hungarian life in the early 20th century, and, of course, Béla Balázs, or Balázs Béla, who was the librettist for Bartók's great opera, Bluebeard's Castle, whose real name was Herbert Bauer. So the Ligeti family, and it joins a group of intellectuals in this context. And Ligeti himself, Hungarian though he was actually born in what is now Romania, in a part of Romania which is extremely complicated in itself. It's part of the Transylvanian part, where the Romanians and Hungarians are all mixed together, and Germans too. This is not far from the Siebenbürgen. Do people know what I'm talking about when I say that? The Siebenbürgen Germans of Romania are the reason why, when you see Frankenstein films, which Frankenstein, the Dr. Frankenstein and the monster, you may have wondered why they're all German. Why do they speak German and they're not in Germany? It's because those are Germans living in that same region. And the fact that Ligeti himself comes from a place where Frankenstein and Dracula and all these people have their origin, as well as the names, as well as Ligeti's peculiar personality in itself, you begin to get a more complicated picture of this witty, brilliant, complicated person. So we'll go on quickly. Ligeti, so I didn't get to study with Ligeti in 1969, but Chowning and I contrived to bring Ligeti to America. And in 1972, Ligeti arrived for the only time for a sustained period in the United States, where he taught at Stanford University, where I was a doctoral student, and I was his doctoral student. And I'm honored to say that he signed my dissertation. I'm probably, because they don't do this in Germany really, I'm maybe the only student of his ever who had a dissertation signed by Ligeti. And he was very much separating the sheep from the goats then. There was a lot of students that gathered around him at Stanford who really didn't know much about him yet, but he decided that one or two of us would have special time with him. And somehow he took this goat for a sheep or a sheep for a goat, and he had me come to his house where I would spend hours. I would come for a lesson at 3 in the afternoon, and sometime around midnight, we would stop talking and he would let me go. He was completely fascinated with America at the time. He had never been to the United States. He had never seen the Pacific Ocean. And also, interestingly enough, and this is just in passing, I don't want to overstate this, but I do want to get it out there, he remarked to me that he had never been in a place where Jewish people walked around completely without anxiety about what the society was like around them. This was something that took me by surprise, because I actually didn't realize that Ligeti was Jewish or that had a Jewish ancestry. Those of you who know his history know that it's tragic, because his father and his brother were taken during World War II. At the end, when the Germans took over Hungary, they were taken to Auschwitz, where they both perished. And so the only remaining members of Ligeti's original family were himself and his mother. And this plays a role, as you will see as we get further into the story. So Ligeti is there at Stanford, and I'm completely overwhelmed and amazed by what he does. I'm learning a lot about how he thinks, not so much in the individual lessons, but by what he taught. He taught a very, very intense study of a early Webern string quartet, in which he analyzed every single note. It was kind of startling, because the piece only had about 20 notes, but it took him 20 hours to analyze every single note of that Webern quartet. And he also talked about Mahler, who he had an enormous appreciation for, and you can understand the complexity of that relationship because there's some similarities there in the tradition between these two great composers. And he gave me my, I just want to mention this further. When he came, he said, you know, I'm not really interested in getting to know the American academic muckety-mucks here in California. And I've met some, his most deprecatory thing that he would ever say would be something like, it is not very interesting. And that was killer. If he said that to you, you would put a bullet in your head, and that was the end of the day for you. And he said, so I don't want to show those people, so who do you want to see, Judge? Who do you want to go to visit? Well, he wanted to visit with Terry Riley, who was at that time he was just teaching at Mills College, I think, studying Indian music. And he wanted to meet Harry Partch. If the people here may know that American composer, at that time was living on a boat in Sausalito and built his own instruments. And Ligeti was fascinated with these things. You get a sense for the composer when you realize that for him, he was like, anything that he didn't know that interested him could become grist for his compositional mill. The conventional life of composers and their trajectories, that didn't interest him so much. People who did something that he found stimulating and unique were the things that he went after. So it was very hard to impress him with simple achievements, like, oh, you wrote a really good string quartet. Not so interesting. Oh, but you built an instrument that has 27 notes to the octave, and I can hear it, played. That was interesting to him. So that's 69, 70. And then he gave me, I want to reveal his great lesson to me, which I think I told Bálint at one lesson. At that time, I was very interested in very complicated music. I mean, the computer opened the door to a lot of it. And Ligeti himself was incredibly fascinated by the computer and was decisive in bringing Chowning to France, where Chowning's discoveries and his community helped build IRCAM. There is no IRCAM and Boulez's great research facility in the Beaubourg without Chowning. And it is Ligeti, in a sense, who promoted that. But at the same time, I was kind of swept away with that complexity. I was writing a piece of music that in some ways resembled Boulez's Third Piano Sonata, which is a very complicated piece he never finished. It has random parts that can be put together in different ways. And I brought it into Ligeti, and he was looking at it, and he looked at it for a long time, and he looked at this one bar, and he said, Martin, why you do write this bar? Why you write this bar? And of course, being a very up-and-coming, a composer wanting to impress my teacher, I said, well, it's the retrograde inversion, and it takes all these time point relationships, and I'm boring you already, I'm sure, but I thought this would be the ticket to, wow, he would really like it. And finally, Ligeti looked at me and he said, Martin, no. From now on, he said, you may not write an ugly bar. And I was like, what? This lesson has now remained with me for the rest of my life. It's as if he's like Jiminy Cricket sitting on my shoulder. Anytime I try to write something very complicated that is not sounding like anything, I hear his voice saying, no, you may not write an ugly bar. It's not possible. And that was a great liberating thing, because it's not as though Ligeti's music, as you've heard tonight, is free of wonderful architectural complexities. But he insisted that if the complexity itself was the reason and excuse for some sonic event, it was insufficient. The sonic event and the intellectual substructure had to achieve a kind of harmony with each other. Otherwise, it was inadequate. Now, this is a very high bar. Well, of course, then the other part is that Ligeti insisted it be new. At this time, Ligeti was very, very, I think I can say it. He was consistently feeling insecure about his position in the avant-garde. I wrote a paper, actually, my one scholarly paper about him called George Ligeti, Immigrant to the Avant-Garde. Because I don't think in some important way the conventional European avant-garde was the country that he really wanted to settle in. And in fact, time bore me out about that. He did not eventually settle in it. But at the time, given that he was a kind of competitive guy, he would say, Martin, who are the greatest composers now? What do you think? Stockhausen? Boulez? No? Berio? What do you think? Ligeti, right? He's in there somewhere. So it was like, yeah, what am I going to say? No. I mean, I have no excuse for this. But the fact is that any composer who had a past that included the music you heard tonight, the early music, it's impossible to imagine pieces by Stockhausen and Boulez that were anything like that. How is Ligeti, that is the baggage that this immigrant arrives with in Darmstadt. And he is now one of the Darmstadt high figures, sitting next to Boulez, sitting next to Stockhausen. And he is, in my presence, repudiating his Hungarian music. That must be said. In 1972, while I was studying with him, a recording came out of Sweden by a Swedish woodwind quintet. It was the first recording that I knew about of any of Ligeti's music that was available from the Hungarian period. And that woodwind quintet are woodwind quintet arrangements of some of the Ricercata that Lisa played tonight. And when I heard that, I mean, it was 1969 in California, 1972 in California. My mind was expanding in many directions for many reasons, but particularly when I heard that music, I was astonished because on the one hand, I recognized very quickly in my mind that some of the things he was doing already in Melodian and in other works that I had heard, for example, the concerto for 13 instruments, whose premiere I had heard in Vienna, were already being prefigured to some degree in this other music that he was writing already in Hungary. But when I pointed that out to him, he said no. He said, no, that's folklore. I don't do that. That's from the Stalinist period. I don't have anything to do with that music. The eventual assimilation into his own language and his own being able to accept this, I think, is in some ways part of the story of the rest of his compositional life. And it will go on from there. So in 1982, Ligeti in 1970, as the time at Stanford came to an end, Ligeti was offered a position in Hamburg to teach composition in Germany. He felt very conflicted about this. He kind of felt comfortable in Austria because of the proximity to Hungary, and it's more, Austria-Hungary, Königlich und Kaiserlich. It's the old Austro-Hungarian sort of thing. Hamburg is pretty cool and very German, and there he was going up to Germany to teach, and he was going to have a seminar, and he had grave doubts about whether any significant composer could actually have a seminar in composition and teach a number of students. After all, Boulez didn't do that. Stockhausen didn't do that. Nono didn't do that. So, and again, these are he thought of them in some ways as his equals and competitors. So how are they going to look at him now that he is going to be der heilige Professor von Komposition in Hamburg? Well, he took the job, and he did really well at it. On the other hand, he had a huge crisis of activity, which goes back to something that he said in 72. In 1972, this is true too. So you're hearing things that other people won't tell you. He said to me, I have a commission from the Swedish television for an opera. And I've had this commission for almost 10 years. And they keep asking me for it, and I'm late. 10 years late. And what was it supposed to be? It was supposed to be an opera based on The Tempest. He loved Shakespeare, and he loved the English language. And he loved Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll from Alice in Wonderland was a favorite of his too in literature. But in the meantime, he decided, I got to get this commission done. I've already spent the money. And he found a different libretto, and it became Le Grand Macabre. Those of you who know his one major opera. But that was a trauma for him because he said, he said to me again in his charming accent, he said, Martin, I am tired of anti-opera. I hate anti-opera. I don't want to write anti-opera. I said, okay, what are you going to do? He said, I want to write an anti-opera. So I said, well, anti leaves opera, right? He laughed because he had a great sense of humor, but of course he didn't want to completely accept the fact that he was actually writing an opera. But he writes an amazing opera. How many people have seen Le Grand Macabre here or know anything about it? The world ends in it, for one thing. One of the things in the libretto is that the world literally ends in Le Grand Macabre. It has to be reborn. Originally, it was a much sexier thing. They forced him to change the names of the leading figures, male and female figures, to make them acceptable. He had a kind of scatological side, Professor Ligeti, and they wouldn't let him go ahead with that, but it precipitated a great crisis. Because all of Ligeti's historical knowledge and his great cultural background came out in that opera. He wrote arias, he wrote passacaglias, he wrote neotonal moments. At the same time as he wrote an overture for automobile horns. The opera begins with an automobile horn fugue. And to be able to open the door to all this different kind of music meant to shatter the pristine world of modernism that was flourishing around him, but he meant that he had to take it. Whatever the tradition that he was confronting was now going to have to be faced. And it caused a great crisis. And you find almost no music written after Le Grand Macabre at all. He writes very little. He wrote the piece that Bálint played, the Hungarian Rock, and he wrote another piece called Passacaglia Ungherese, the Hungarian Passacaglia, where he's experimenting with the forms that he knew from his days as a student in Budapest. Now, I didn't mention this, but what also came out, which he kind of kept under the table, was that when he was a teacher in Budapest, he wrote 2 books on harmony. He was a completely thoroughly trained academic composer in the old school. And here is all this learning and all this tradition and the music that he had absorbed as a young composer. Who had wanted to study with Bartók, but Bartók was in America and did not return in time. What is he supposed to do with all this material? I think that complexity and the desire to assimilate and give voice to that tradition, as well as his thirst for modernity, forms the great crisis that occurs in the period just before 1982, when I saw him again for an extended period. I came to visit him, and this is anecdotal. I'm doing pretty well in time. This is anecdotal but fun. I come to see him in Hamburg, and I come with my young family. That time my daughter was 8 years old, and he wants to look at my music, but he doesn't have time to do it then. On the other hand, when we come to his apartment in Hamburg, he is living terribly. He looks terrible. He's bedraggled. His shirt is not clean. His toilet doesn't work in the apartment. Scores are scattered around. The desk is filled with things. And he says, leave me your scores and come back. Are you going to be here for a while? Come back in 3 days, and then you and I will sit and we'll talk about it. Well, I mean, what an opportunity for me. But while he's telling me this, I look over on his table, and on his table is a score, like a graph paper, and on the paper is every kind of color, a different color, like red, blue, orange, yellow, green, and they're all tracing, as far as I can see from where I'm standing, different superimposed lines of counterpoint. But he uses colors to distinguish them. It's kind of an interesting idea. But in order to do that, he has on his desk, which is a mess, all these different pencils, one green, one yellow, one red, and so on. And my little daughter at that time had just been wandering around. We got her a pad to draw pictures on. She got one of these pencils in Hamburg that it had all the colors in a single pencil. So you could just turn the pencil slightly and it would draw red, or turn a little bit of it orange or green. And when Ligeti saw this pencil, his eyes got really wide, because in one stroke, he could have a pencil that did what 7 pencils did. And then he didn't know exactly how to deal with this, because, you know, my daughter was like 8 years old. I could take her pencil. So he looked at me like, so I asked my daughter, Johanna, I said, Johanna, would you like to give George here that pencil? You know, and she was like, yeah, I'll give him the pencil. He was delighted, and my daughter gave Ligeti the pencil that he then used. The piece that he was working on for that, by the way, so those of you who know his work, was eventually going to become the first of the piano etudes, Desord. And one of the was a study for further contrapuntal studies in the piano etudes. When I came back later, 3 days later, my heart was in my mouth, because, you know, here I am going to visit my beloved and great master, and he's made me wait 3 days, and he might just say, well, you know, it is not really interesting. And I would have to just throw myself in the Ulster, you know, in Hamburg. But it turns out that he really liked it. So on the other hand, he said, you know, I've copied your music. I didn't know it, but I was copying it. He put on a piece of his, which sounded mysteriously somehow like one of the pieces I had just given him, which he had actually written 3 years before I wrote my piece, which I didn't know about. So, but he liked jokes like that, like he was imitating me. It was absurd. That piece was Clocks and Clouds. Some of you might know the piece Clocks and Clouds. The title comes from another great Hungarian philosopher with whom Ligeti was acquainted, and that is Karl Popper. People know that name at all? You might. Turns out Ligeti's aunt is Agnes Heller, who has just died recently, is a fantastic philosopher, both Hungarian and in English, worked at Bard College. So you may end up actually discovering more about Agnes Heller. But Ligeti looked terrible. And when Ligeti showed me what he was working on, he said, I have a commission for a horn trio. I thought, my God, a horn trio? What in the world are you doing with a horn trio? He said, yes, and it's due in August. And he's showing me this in July. He's got one movement written. I mean, he's a terrible example for my students. I mean, I went to deadlines, and it's just how he got away with this, I don't know. He's charm, I think. There's no other way to say it. And I looked at the score, and you could see right on the first page of the score that, far from being anything to do with Brahms and the horn trio, even though it uses the same instrumentation, is a quotation that's slightly distorted of Beethoven's Lebewohl Sonata, or Farewell Sonata. And when I saw that, my heart went into my throat, and I thought, he's writing his own farewell for us. He looked terrible. And it turned out that he was in very bad shape, but not that he was himself going to say farewell. His mother had died in 1982, and that meant the last member of his family, his intimate family, that had managed to survive the war was gone. And survivor guilt and God knows what else in that complex relationship that he had with his mother had really overcome him. He was not well, but was an amazing experience. The next time I saw him for any length of time was in New York in 1985. He had just won the Grauemeyer Prize in Louisville for the etudes, some of you, the pieces you have heard tonight. And I came to see him there, and he, at that time, I'm going to make this one rather short. We spent a really long time together, actually not far from here. He was staying at the hotel on 59th, overlooking the park. He was very happy in this wonderful, fancy hotel. He liked to be in the fancy hotel. He had many, many rooms they had arranged for him. What is it called? Oh, someone. Let's say again? Yeah, the Plaza. That's it. Yeah, yeah. And so again, it was, hours and hours and hours. And this time I thought, I'm not going to spend hours and hours talking to this guy and not remember everything, because memory is faulty. So after like 2 in the morning when we stopped talking, I went down to the bar there, which is a famous bar, and I sat down and I just wrote everything that I could remember that he said. And I have those documents. I'm waiting for somebody to ask me to share them, but it hasn't happened yet. But at that time, he said a very funny thing, because by this time he had made up with Stanley Kubrick. You know, the music for 2001 that they used in that was not paid for. They just stole it. When Kubrick took the music, he just took it. And he waited for the Europeans to sue him somehow for this. And so Ligeti was very mad, because at first he thought, oh, he told me, oh, this is disgraceful. My music should be associated with this science fiction or something. But at the same time, he was incredibly intrigued, and he finally did make a settlement, and he was somewhat startled, I think, to see how this movie score had suddenly made him a very famous person, and Kubrick wanted more. So in fact, some of the music that you heard tonight in the Ricercata is used in Eyes Wide Shut. And Ligeti said, oh yes, I gave him that music, but this time I made him pay for it. And he said, and they paid me more than they paid Penderecki. That's not untypical of Ligeti to say such a thing, you know, and okay, all right, that's something. That's a nice story. Okay, in 1988, I saw him in the seminar. I actually got the chance to visit him in his seminar in Hamburg, and what was interesting about that, among other things, was that at that time, in the seminar were some very, very young composers who were soon to become rather prominent, among whom was Hans Abrahamsen, wonderful Danish composer. Any people here know Hans Abrahamsen? Not really. And Unsuk Chin, who is a Korean composer who has written music really which sounds lots like Ligeti's music. Ligeti was very mad about this. I just wanted to tell you that. He was not happy with Unsuk Chin because she sounded like him. And Ligeti had said to me on any number of other occasions, little Ligetis, this I don't like this. I don't, little, no. You did, if you came in with something that you showed that complete imitative thing of what he was doing, he was not in the least happy with you, and he was not happy with Unsuk Chin, and so they had a very rocky relationship. On the other hand, Ligeti himself had now been taking the brunt of his change from the foreground of the avant-garde into somebody who could write a tonal end of Hungarian rocks with a major chord. All these, you know, even to this day, if you play a major triad in Germany, you're out. You know, you might as well not even be there. So he was now, he was becoming and remained, despite his fame and the significance of his music, a kind of outsider in German avant-garde musical life. And he said at the time that what he was interested in doing, he felt trapped by being in the avant-garde. And he said, the avant-garde is a trap, and the reactionaries are a trap. He would love to escape altogether. He said he would like to write music that is weder modern noch postmodern, which in German is neither modern nor postmodern. He wanted some individual way away from the prevailing winds of either direction. And at this time, he starts to discover the music of sub-Saharan Africa, music of the Akona people and other peoples from that area, as well as he hears the music of the American composer Conlon Nancaro. Some of you might know him. He wrote music for player piano, so has this wonderful mechanical character. I'll come back to that. Okay, so. Yeah, of course. Then when I saw him in 1993. We invited him to, and this is probably the best story of the night, so maybe I'll stop after this one and let you ask some questions, because there's many more, but this is one of the best, because we invited him for his 70th birthday to have celebrated with us at Yale. And he came to New Haven, and there's a couple of parts to it. When he arrived from the airport in town, I came to meet him and help him get into his hotel. And he had 2 suitcases. And in those days, there was not yet an elevator in that hotel, and he was on the 2nd floor, so I offered to carry the suitcases. Of course, I would carry the suitcases up to the second floor. And I picked them both up, and one of them was like, yeah, I could manage it, no problem. The other one was like, oh, incredibly heavy. And they looked the same size, but one like weighed 10 times what the other one weighed. And I schlepped them up to the second floor, and I put them on the bed there, and one of the beds that he wasn't using. And I said, George, I get this one, but what, did you bring your rock collection from Hamburg or something, or your favorite minerals or something? And he laughed, and he had a great sense of humor, and he said, Martin, open the first one. And so I opened the one that was very light, and inside was some rumpled clothes, nothing particularly amazing. But when I opened the second one, you just touched the levers, and the springs popped, and out spilled all this music, and it fell on the floor. Score after score after score. And what it was the Chopin etudes, the Schumann etudes, the Liszt etudes, the Debussy etudes, Scriabin etudes. He had been studying all the etudes of the great 19th century masters and early 20th century masters. And he said, if I can put a Schumann etude on the piano and bear to look at mine, then it stays. Otherwise, I throw it away. He loved that music. And he once said to me, I'm a very unusual composer, Martin, because I'm a music lover. And that's a funny thing to say, because many of us compose. Now there's Jerome, my friend, is laughing. He knows. We know composers sometimes are not music lovers. They love what they do, and that is the end of the story. There's a kind of narcissism that can never find an end. It's an eternal narcissism. But he genuinely loved this other music, and he tried to encompass it in some significant way. So he, just to tell a final tale about myself in this little story. Oh, well, I have to tell two more, so then I'll stop. Louis Andriessen, my friend, used to say, Martin, you are an anecdote machine. You know? So one of the things that happened was that we did a performance of his Lux Aeterna at Yale, which is 16 solo voices. And everything had gone really well, but Ligeti was a terrible taskmaster for performance. He scared the crap out of performers because he could not bear anything less than the tempo he indicated and the speed that he indicated. He was, if you look at his scores, there's not only very carefully written notes with all the conventional musical identifying marks, but he often writes like a paragraph about how you are to treat this thing in German and in English. So when we got there, it turns out the conductor of this chorale, 16 solo voices, Maggie Brooks, said to me, "No, Martin, I'm really sorry, but our last alto is sick and she can't sing tonight. I don't really want to cancel this performance. We've worked so hard on it, but if we're going to be able to do this performance of the Lux Aeterna, I'm going to have to sing that alto part. So would you conduct it?" This is prima vista. Now, I knew the score, and if people who know Lux Aeterna know that it's actually, you just have to beat 4. You don't really have to do much more. The complexity is in the individual lines. It's not that I have to do all these fancy motions. So grudgingly, I said, we can't cancel this. This is his birthday. This is an incredible concert. His 70th birthday. I'll conduct it. So I'm going to go conduct it. Meanwhile, as a little anecdote, he's dying to meet Benoit Mandelbrot, who is teaching at Yale at the time. Do people know Mandelbrot? Fractal geometry. He is the father of fractal geometry, self-similar mathematics. It's a very interesting subject. And he gets to meet Mandelbrot backstage before he goes out. And they shake hands and then they talk. And then Ligeti says to me, "He's a very nice man, but he knows nothing about music." So, okay, all right, there you go. Benoit Mandelbrot knows nothing about music. That's quite all right. So when we get out there, I conduct the piece, and I think it goes pretty well. We get a lot of applause, and it's really gone well. And then the concert ends with his horn trio, and when it's over, Ligeti comes out, and he finds me and he drags me out on stage. He wants me to take some of the credit for organizing this, and my second string quartet was played, and he always liked that piece. And there's a photo that Chris Theophilidis took of me and Ligeti. Ligeti's holding my hand very tightly. He's wearing one of those sweaters that he always wears. What do you call those sweaters, Lisa? You know, it's kind of Australian multicolored sweater. And we're holding hands, and we're bowing and smiling, and Ligeti is saying to me, Martin, from now on, please do not conduct my choral music. Yeah. So you're getting a feel for the guy, right? I mean, and the final story I'll tell really is really very touching in some ways. My wife and I go to the Théâtre du Châtelet in the year 1999, where Ligeti is going to have his piano concerto performed by Pierre-Laurent Aimard, who you should go to see, who is also playing in the season in New York. And Aimard is going to be playing the piano concerto under the direction of George Benjamin with the Ensemble Intercontemporain at the Théâtre du Châtelet. Wonderful event. And I go to see Ligeti, and there's many stories about that. But before I go inside, there's another guy standing with Ligeti talking to him, and Louise Ducheneau, who was Ligeti's amanuensis, was always looking after him, says to me, "Oh, Martin, you don't know this other person?" I said, "No, I've never met him. Who is that person?" And it's a very tall guy, kind of hunched over, very serious like that. And she says, "Oh, that's Kortag. That's Kortag." Oh, wow. Oh, so now I'm really put on my best behavior. Kortag being Ligeti's great friend, Hungarian composer, enormously recognized, and he's now very, very old. In any case, we all go into the theater. Kortag doesn't join us where I'm sitting with Ligeti and Lisa, and he has a score. I see Kortag has a score of the piano concerto. He goes over to the side, and Aimard has in those days, there's no these wonderful little devices where you turn the page with your foot or your hand. Aimard has like a billboard about this big with music stuck on it in all places because he's no time to turn pages in the piano concerto. He's like glued to this material. And the George Benjamin, a wonderful conductor, he gives the cue. The ensemble is fantastic. They play the opening movement of the piano concerto is very much a kind of orchestration of Des Ordres from the piano etudes. It's a very complicated, virtuosic piece. They're sweating bullets, and they get through it, and it's like, wow, we're like really impressed. But Ligeti, maybe not so. He goes down to the stage, and I go and I'm listening in, and he says, I'm sorry to say this, Pierre-Laurent, but I have to say it's too slow. And I could see Laurent's like eyes, Aimard's like eyes are, as big as saucers. I mean, they've just played this demonic speed. And he says it's too slow. So then the ensemble is looking around, George Benjamin's looking around, like, what do we do now? And Ligeti says, well, would you mind playing it again, faster? This is to the Ensemble Intercontemporain. This is the Théâtre du Châtelet. These players, I could hear like stirrings of like mutiny, like in Billy Budd. Like the players, like, oh, I'm gonna play this thing again, And they're all very happy. But Pierre Laurent, he's always very obedient. He'll do what he's supposed to do. So he's sweating, but he's got his old papers ready. He's ready to play again. But he can see that Benjamin sees that the orchestra's not very happy about this. And Ligeti, who could read a room very well, says to the orchestra, oh, I see you're not happy. You're not happy. But if you look over there, you see Kortag. And if I have to go I let Kortag run the rehearsal. And at that point, you could see they back off because Kortag's reputation was worse than Ligeti's. I mean, Kortag is the kind of guy who 2 hours to do the first 2 bars of a Beethoven quartet, that was maybe enough time. So they immediately go, they started right away and they did it. That's pretty much the story. There are some other lovely little touches, but I think I'll stop now and and I'll ask if you have any questions or you want some further elucidation. You know, this is one cannot, I think, with a figure of this complexity and this imaginative talent, you know, everybody has their own Ligeti in some ways. People will view him differently depending on their own standpoint and point of view. One of my students who met him at that concert in 1993, Amy Bauer, has become probably the foremost scholar of Ligeti in America. She's just written a wonderful book. If you're interested in more intensive studies of Ligeti's work, Amy's book is about the lamento motif in Ligeti, because one of the things that does recur many, many times, along with one of the tunes that you heard Lisa play tonight, is a lamento, Romanian lamento motif. But everyone will have their own take. My take is a personal one with a long relationship and one of great affection, and that I don't disguise. So thank you for listening. But I think if there's somebody has a question, you have a microphone. Okay. If somebody has a question, maybe Bálint will give you the microphone if you want to ask a question. And I promise to make this end so that you're not feeling captured here. So if somebody has any questions, raise your hand and Bálint will give you a microphone. Anybody have any? Yeah.
Yes, I have a question about what you mentioned at the beginning of your wonderful speech, and thank you for sharing this with us, is that when Ligeti came to the avant-garde, especially in Germany, and with this baggage of Hungarian heritage, what was his further dealings with that? Like, obviously in the orchestral scores, you don't detect that kind of Hungarian-ness in it, but for example, in the horn trio, or in the violin concerto, you definitely hear it much later. So you hear a composer who kind of really integrated that in his later style. Yeah,
I want to say unequivocally that by around 1978, he had lost he was no longer the bleeding edge of the avant-garde in Germany. They were no longer considering him that, because he was too retro for them. He used triads and periodic rhythms. He was able to accept. He once told me that what he really wanted to do was to create the folklore of a non-existent people. And if you think about his last piece, Fifes, Drums, and Fiddles, which in Hungarian, you should say the title in Hungarian.
Síppal dobbal.
Síppal dobbal, there's another one.
Nádi hegedűvel.
There you go, yeah. Yeah.
Weöres.
That piece actually is a kind of a folklore that it's sort of Hungarian in ways. It's Weöres, again, the great poet.
Weöres Sándor.
Sándor. But it's also something else. And that would not have been acceptable to most German avant-gardists in any way. The idea that folklore could play a role, I don't think they could accept that. But that ideologically free zone made for me and some of his students a playground for us to find our own way without restraint, as long as it was the highest quality, of which he insisted all the time. Other question? Anyone else want something? Nobody? All right. Oh, there's one more question. Okay.
Hi. I was just curious about his teaching philosophy.
You know, I think he inevitably taught more effectively by having you listen to his scores than he did by any particular strategy as a teacher. One of the things that he did, which was extraordinary, was he had an unbelievably precise ear. So he could look at your score and tell if the sonority you were aiming at was not working. And he would demand of you to know why. Why was your sonority not working? Why did this not work? Why didn't this sound? It's not that he had an aesthetic, preordained concept of the beautiful, but things had to pay off in the sonic world. And that's pretty much what it was. So, you look at his scores and you learn from the kinds of things that he did more than any particular lesson. Again, I remember anecdotal things. One of the composers he admired more than any other was Debussy. And he said, Debussy is the mildest modernist you could imagine. There's nothing that ever happens in Debussy that would cause an audience to take out an umbrella and hit somebody over the head, which of course is what the famous story of the L'Histoire of Rider Spring, where Stravinsky's pieces played, everybody gets so excited, riots break out. No, Debussy is a much subtler cat, and I think that's Ligeti's. He likes to pick your pocket without you knowing how he did it. He kind of keeps that on the down low. He never. I mean, the number of, in the piece that Lisa played, the fanfares, one thing you might not notice, you have this ostinato that runs throughout the whole piece, keeps going up the scale, up and up and up and up. But at every juncture point in that ostinato, there's a triadic chord. First it's in major, then it's in minor. That's not something he would talk about in a class. That's something you had to find out by looking at the score. Yeah. I don't think he had, I think he was particularly inoculated against a priori ideological formations. He was not happy with them. If you had sworn allegiance, say, to, I don't know what, spectralism or new complexity or any of the isms of late 20th and early 21st century music, I think he would shrug, because he felt for most composers those stylistic quirks were like a little bit like what happens at the end of Bluebeard's Castle, where Judith is forced to wear the clothing of the previous dead wives, and it doesn't suit her. So he would urge you to find your own clothing. You're not supposed to wear somebody else's clothing. I mean, but he didn't. It's not as though he had you won't find that in a book. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank all our performers one more time. And the Liszt Institute for organizing this event. And we have a special guest tonight, the ambassador for Hungary of the UN with us present tonight. So please give her applause. Thank you for your work. And everybody, please just give another round of applause to everybody. And thanks for coming.